Hi, and welcome back to Bread from Heaven. Let's get reading. We're on chapter 4. At the KGB headquarters, Sergei was immediately taken to an interrogation room. He sat waiting for more than an hour before the KGB officer who had arrested him finally came in. With him was a second officer, a man with cold blue eyes and an angry face. He was taller than the arresting officer, had an angular frame, and was dressed in some kind of a military uniform, and he was a chain smoker. Survey marveled at the way he lit up one cigarette after another, like he was on some kind of a smoking marathon. And then the questions began in rapid succession. Where did you hold your secret meeting? We know you had a secret church meeting during the last 24 hours. What time exactly? Who was at the meeting? Who is the next president of your organization? For 3 hours, the KGB officers questioned Sergei, but always he gave them the same answer. I can't reveal that information, gentlemen. It wouldn't be right. My church members are like family. The mustached officer in the blue suit became impatient now, and he nodded at the other officer who was still chain-smoking cigarettes. He leaned down close to Sergei's face, a cigarette dangling from his mouth. If you don't give us the answers we want, he growled, we'll use other forms of persuasion. Sergei knew the man was serious. KGB officers were known for their brutality. He was surprised that it had taken them this long to get physical. The two officers left, and then a soldier came in and led Sergei away. He took Sergei to a nearby warehouse, tied him to a utility pole, and began to beat him with a rubber hose. Sergei closed his eyes and breathed a prayer. Please be with me, Lord. He could hear the rubber hose whistling through the air before it hit him, but to his surprise, it really didn't hurt that much. In fact, he hardly felt it. How could that be, he wondered. He had been whipped before by the KGB, and it had always been a frightening experience. But then Sergei remembered a story he had read in a book titled The Great Controversy. It was a story about John Wesley, who was a great church reformer in England during the 1700s. A mob roaming the streets didn't like his preaching and was trying to run him out of town. They began to beat him using bricks and sticks and bare fists. Wesley felt the blood running down his head and face, but everything the mob did seemed to have no effect on him. In fact, he felt no pain. Sergei had to admit that his own situation was very much like John Wesley's. He could feel the rubber hose cutting through his shirt and the welts rising, but strangely enough, he felt no pain. Why, Lord, he kept asking, why spare me? You didn't spare Jesus. Finally, the soldier took him back to the interrogation room. The wee hours of the morning had arrived, and Sergei knew that he should be tired, but he wasn't. It was like he had his second wind, and nothing could get him down. Sergei breathed a prayer for strength as he waited for what would come next. He asked God to be with him through this ordeal and help him to be faithful. Don't let me fail you, Father. Don't let me waver in my resolve to honor you. You sent your Son to live and die for me. The least that I can do for you, Lord, is to suffer for the sake of the gospel. I'll do it gladly with all my soul and strength and mind. And then he prayed earnestly that God would help Lena to be brave. I know she's afraid, Father, but she can be strong too. He almost smiled to himself as he remembered her stubborn streak. She was persistent, not easily persuaded against her will, and she came by it naturally. Her father and mother were of Jewish descent and had been through severe persecution and exile at the turn of the century. She'll make it, Sergei thought. She's a strong woman, and I know God will help her remember the family stock that she came from. After another hour, the two KGB officers came back and offered Sergei coffee and Russian black bread. Sergei accepted the bread but declined the coffee. As he munched on the bread, he thought of all the Bible heroes who had been persecuted because they stood for what was right. Joseph, Jeremiah, Daniel, Peter, Paul, and of course Jesus. It stirred Sergei's heart to think of their faith and courage under fire, and it made him want to be even more faithful to God in the midst of trials and persecution. After Sergei had finished his bread, the two officers began asking questions again. Relentlessly, they interrogated him, threatened him, and jumped to their feet and screamed in his face. But he would not budge. It was obvious that Sergei wasn't going to betray his church members. Finally, the mustached KGB officer said, "We'll finish here. We have orders to make you talk. But if you'll not talk, then there is nothing else that we can do but give you the maximum penalty for criminals of your sort." He turned to his fellow KGB officer and nodded again. The tall officer stepped closer to Sergei's chair and looked down into the preacher's face. His cold gray eyes appeared lifeless as he grimly announced, "You are now a candidate for prison in the city of Briceni. They know how to deal with your kind there." Sergei swallowed hard. So he was a criminal now? A criminal? For attending a secret late-night church meeting? If this was the worst thing that the KGB had to deal with on a daily basis, then they must truly have an easy life, he reasoned, but of course that didn't help him now. No matter the crime, it appeared that the KGB was going to make Sergei pay, and dearly. Sergei felt no resentment and no anger in his heart toward the men. It was as if the Holy Spirit had come down upon him and given him absolute peace. But by now, he was beginning to feel the effects of staying up all night. Another guard finally came and took Sergei down a long corridor and into a prison cell. The narrow cot looked so inviting that he lay down and immediately fell into an exhausted sleep. How long he slept he didn't know, but when he awoke, a guard was bringing a tin plate of food into his cell. Sergei still had his pocket watch and pulled it out to find it already the late afternoon. He ate the borscht and black bread on his plate and then asked the guard if he was allowed to write a letter to his wife. When the guard brought some paper and a pencil, Sergei wrote several pages and then bowed his head in prayer. He was willing to endure any hardship for God, but he felt badly that Lena had to suffer too. But then he realized that he and his wife were in this thing together, not because he was a pastor, but because they were a team for life. They had promised to stay with one another through good times and bad, in sickness and health, till death should separate them. Sergei didn't know if he would ever see Lena again, or if possibly death would soon separate them, but he guessed that this should not be the most important question on their minds. More importantly, would they be faithful to God no matter what? Sergei sat on the edge of his cot and thought about all that had happened in the last 24 hours. He had been arrested by the KGB and put through the worst of interrogations, but now, after all that had happened, something else suddenly came to mind. Were the other pastors safe? Sergei couldn't ask anyone. If he did, the KGB might go after them too, and that would be a disaster. 14 other men might then be arrested, and that would be tragic for the church. Chapter 5. Sergei lay back down on his cot, put his hands behind his head, and looked up at the ceiling. The biggest question on his mind now was, how had the KGB known that there was a meeting? Someone had evidently heard enough to make the connection. They had to. How else would the KGB officer have known enough to come to Sergei's house to arrest him? But then again, who could say? As the KGB officer had said, they didn't need proof, only suspicion of such actions, and a good excuse to arrest an Adventist preacher. Sergei had been detained all night. He had been through all the usual interrogation procedures he had ever heard of. Persistent questioning, shouting and screaming in the face of the victim, bright lights and threats that intimidated him psychologically, and of course the beatings. Sergei had to be honest with himself. He had expected such treatment by the KGB. As a witness for Jesus, he couldn't even really say that he had been unjustly treated. Now, if he chose to accept Jesus' challenge that Christians who preached the name of Jesus would suffer for the sake of the gospel, not if he chose that. And he had broken the law, after all. The laws of the land said that people were not to meet in secret meetings under cover of darkness. Sergei and his fellow pastors had tried to conceal the meeting, and from that standpoint they had done it illegally. They were guilty, and now Sergei was paying the price. But the laws of the land could not compete with the law of God. Sergei knew that he could not allow the intimidation tactics of the KGB to interfere with God's gospel commission to the world. Jesus had asked Sergei to do his part in spreading the message of salvation to Moldova, and Sergei had accepted the challenge no matter what the price. If Jesus suffered for crimes he never committed, then Sergei guessed that he could do the same. The Son of God was humiliated and beaten and then executed. Why should a mere pastor in the heart of Moldova be surprised if God asked him to do the same? As Sergei lay on his cot in the prison cell, he remembered the words from a passage he had memorized long ago. Christ was treated as we deserve, that we might be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sins, in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness, in which we had no share. He suffered the death, which was ours, that we might receive the life, which was his. With his stripes we are healed. More than ever before, these inspiring words helped Sergei put Jesus' great sacrifice into perspective. These words made him want to go the extra mile and endure any possible hardship for Jesus. His prayer was that he might be worthy to suffer for Jesus' sake. But Lena's safety also weighed heavily on Sergei's mind. He only hoped that she would not have to endure hardships beyond her strength. This was his heart cry to God as he lay on the hard cot in his prison cell. His mind now shifted to his destined fate. Bresseni. The KGB was sending him to an infamous maximum security prison in Bresseni, which was known for its prisoners, men who had notorious reputations for lives of crime. To be imprisoned in Bresseni would be an experience indeed. That was the understatement of the year. Would he live in fear daily? Would his life be in danger? He could hardly imagine it otherwise. Time would tell. But for now he knew. He just had to wait and trust God to take care of everything. As Sergei contemplated his fate, the scenes of his home flashed before his mind. He remembered the little kitchen and the front room with his overstuffed chair in which he loved to read. In his mind's eye, he could see the end table, where he always laid his Bible and the other books used in preparing his sermons. His sermon notes were probably still there, sitting on his open Bible. Lena would pack them all up for safekeeping before she left to stay with her brother. Would he ever be able to preach again? I guess the sermon will have to wait, Sergei sighed ironically as he stretched out on the cot and closed his eyes. For now he had bigger and more important sermons to give. His own sermon in shoes was about to begin, and he knew that it would be far more vivid than any sermon of words that he might give from the pulpit, and far more effective. God would see to that, he was sure. The next morning, Sergei was put on a slow-moving train to Bresseni. The northern city was less than 200 kilometers from Kahul, but the train was stopping frequently to pick up and drop off passengers along the way. For the better part of a day, Sergei rode the train with another prisoner. The two of them were handcuffed and given only one scant meal of bread and water at noon. Sergei smiled at the simple meal. He remembered the promises in the Bible that assured him his bread and water would be sure. "You're keeping your promise," he reminded God with a wry sense of humor. Sergei glanced out the window from time to time, watching the peach and plum orchards pass by. The southern region of Moldova was known for its vineyards, and they made for a very picturesque landscape from the train window. He could hardly believe that a picture of such serenity could be his on a morning when he was on his way to prison. Time and again he found himself bowing his head and praying that God would sustain him through the coming trials. Other passengers traveling to various destinations occupied the same train car with Sergei. Although 2 guards had been assigned to transport the prisoners, they were pretty lenient and allowed the prisoners to get up and stretch their legs now and then. By mid-morning, Sergei was visiting with the passengers sitting next to him on the train car. Some eyed him suspiciously. With handcuffs on, they figured he had to be some kind of criminal. But Sergei was a likable man and not easily discouraged by such conditions, and he was not one for self-pity, even under the circumstances. He leaned towards one of the passengers and said with a twinkle in his eye, "I've been asked to go to Bresseni to represent the God of heaven. The government has chosen me for the job because they know I'm a man of principle." People were listening, but they were also watching the guards warily. If Sergei was a prisoner, why was he being so pleasant? Why was he talking about God so cheerfully? On the other hand, if he really was a criminal of some kind, they wouldn't want to show too much interest in him, or they would be thought to be sympathizers. The guards seemed almost indifferent to Sergei and his ability to entertain the passengers, and they finally headed out the back door of the train car for a smoke. At that point, people really began sitting up and taking notice. "What do you do for a living?" a man about his age asked. "I'm a pastor," Sergei said quietly. "God called me to preach the gospel of Jesus in my hometown. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus, God's Son, came to die for us and save us from sin, because we are his children." The train car was deathly quiet now, and all eyes were on him. Sergei realized he was being given a chance for a mini Bible study, and he wasn't about to lose the opportunity. He might be on his way to prison, but he was going to share the gospel as surely as if he were in the pulpit back home. Chapter 6. The click-clack of the train wheels on the track punctuated Sergei's comments. Today, Jesus is in heaven preparing a home for everyone who chooses to believe in the Son of God. He glanced towards heaven. Someday, soon, Jesus will come back in the clouds of heaven to take us to live with him in heaven. This will bring an end to sin and sickness and sorrow as we know it today. You look like such a nice young man, a little babushka was with a quavering voice half whispered. So why the handcuffs? I'm a servant of God, Sergei smiled. The government tried to force me to provide information about my fellow church leaders, but they are like family to me. I refuse to betray their trust. By now the guards were back, and they were beginning to take notice. This man was receiving more attention from the passengers than they would have expected from a government prisoner. Sergei spoke for a few more minutes on the love of Jesus, but finally one of the guards pointed at him. "Stop!" the guard shouted, obviously annoyed with Sergei. "Come with me," he ordered, leading the way down the aisle of the train car and out the door at the back. Sergei knew now that the chance to witness for his faith had ended, but he thanked God he had been able to introduce a carload of passengers to Jesus. They walked through several more train cars until the guard finally opened the door to the baggage car. "You can stay here for the rest of the trip," he growled. He nodded over his shoulder at the second guard as he entered the car behind them. "Mikhail, here. You keep him company." Sergei sat down on the cold metal floor, leaned against the wall, and closed his eyes. This was a clear case of solitary confinement, intended to isolate him from the other passengers. The devil had interrupted his Bible study and his chance to speak for God on the train, and now the window of opportunity had closed. But God wasn't through with Sergei yet. Mikhail pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket and lit it. As he puffed on the cigarette, he watched Sergei. Finally, he sat down beside him on the floor. "So you're a preacher, are you?" He continued puffing on the cigarette. "I used to go to Sunday Mass when I was a boy." "Really?" Sergei was interested now. "My mother and father used to take me to a Greek Orthodox church. Those were good old days," he mused. "We live in Straseni, and my parents were very religious. In spite of what the government said about the superiority of communism, my father always said that God was the only real answer to the problems of a country." Mikhail dropped the finished butt of his cigarette on the floor and smudged it out with his foot. "My father didn't have a formal education, not much beyond basic preparatory school anyway. He left after his 9th year of school, but he liked to read. He became a self-educated man, and he learned a lot about Soviet history and politics. My mother says she thinks he talked too much, because one day the KGB came and took him away. We never saw him again." Mikhail's face was bitter. "I was only 7. "I'm sorry," was all Sergei could say. "I'm very sorry." "No matter," Mikhail retorted indignantly. "I've never had much use for God since then. My father was a religious man, and God couldn't even protect him against his own government. And joining the Communist Red Army? It hasn't helped much either, has it?" Sergei glanced at the uniformed guard. "I guess you could say that." Mikhail took off his green military cap. "But?" Sergei studied Mikhail's stern face. Mikhail eyed Sergei curiously. "You are very perceptive." He began to chuckle. I know. You're going to say there are no buts when it comes to God. Huh, that sounds just like my father." "And you believe that too, don't you?" "Maybe." Mikhail began turning his cap round and round in his hand. "Your father was a wise man," Sergei said. "He didn't die for nothing, you know. That's what my mother always said. If it was worth believing, she said it was worth living for. And dying for." "I've always thought so," Sergei nodded, "and when it comes to standing up for God, it's doubly so." Mikhail squinted in Sergei's direction. "I believe you really mean that. How does that work for you?" "It's simple. Jesus came to this world and stood up against the religious leaders of the day. He never backed down, and in the end they crucified him on a cruel cross." Sergei's voice was solemn. "Jesus was not afraid to do this for me. How can I do less for him? I'll get my reward soon when he comes again to take me home to heaven. For now I'm content to represent him here and tell as many people as possible about the good news of the gospel." "Wow!" Mikhail hung his head again in respect. "You sound so sure of yourself." "I am, and you can be too, Mikhail. Just believe it. This is your chance to be sure of your salvation. Why not do it here, today? We can pray about it now if you want." And so they prayed after their heartfelt discussion, and Mikhail gave his heart to Jesus. It was all so moving for Sergei that he didn't know how long they had been riding or how far they had come. Only as he felt the train start to slow and the brakes begin to squeal did he realize the trip was nearly over. The next stage in his ordeal was about to begin. What would it be like in the government prison? What would they put him through? Would he have to suffer much? Would he remain faithful to God? There was no doubt in Sergei's mind that by God's strength he would make it, and through it all he would continue to be a brave witness for God. He had to. How could he do anything else? After all, Jesus had suffered so much for him. We'll stop there. We'll continue tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow for more Bread from Heaven.